This is Matthew Cratter from Trader University, and today I want to talk about the collapsing petrodollar standard. What happened back in 1971 is Nixon brought the US dollar off of a gold standard, and it ended the convertibility of US dollars into gold. You used to be able to go to the so-called Treasury window, give them some paper US dollars, and you could redeem it for actual physical gold. This became no longer possible in 1971, and this really ended the whole Bretton Woods system and paved the way for the modern petrodollar system. So because the US dollar was no longer backed by gold, the US and other large powers were looking for a way to backstop the US dollar. There was a new implicit backing that was needed for US dollars. And so this agreement was made in the early 70s with the Saudis and other oil-producing countries, and this was the agreement. The Saudis and other countries would agree to sell oil only in exchange for US dollars. They would agree not to accept any other currencies. They got all the other oil-producing countries, especially in the Middle East, to go along with this. And in order to make the oil market large enough, oil prices were allowed to skyrocket in the 1970s in order to increase the overall value of the crude oil market and allow it to become big enough to serve as a sort of backstop for the US dollars. That's why if you lived through the 1970s, I was quite young then, but I remember the long gas lines, etc. You can see here how oil appreciated in the early 70s and has really never looked back. It was completely revalued for these purposes. So the US moved basically from a gold standard where you actually had convertibility into gold to a petrodollar standard where the dollars weren't necessarily backed by crude oil itself, but by pricing crude oil in US dollars, you made the US dollar essential worldwide. Anyone who wanted some crude oil needed to be able to get their hands on some US dollars. And then you had something happen called petrodollar recycling. So the Saudis would sell the US crude oil for US dollars, and then they would recycle those US dollars back into US Treasuries. And this was one way that the US government was able to help finance its debts before China came on the scene and was admitted to the World Trade Organization in 2001 and became the major buyer of US Treasuries. But for a while, it was the oil-producing countries. Since the 1970s, all global commodities have mostly been priced in US dollars. And so if you're a country, if you're a corporation, a foreign corporation, and you think you might need some crude oil or other commodities this year, even if you don't have a relationship with the US, even if you want to go straight to the Saudis and buy oil from them, you needed to somehow get your hands on some US dollars. And if you're not the Federal Reserve, if you're not the United States itself, you need to actually earn those US dollars in order to buy crude oil or other commodities. They don't just hand out US dollars. You need to provide goods or services in order to stockpile them. And then once you got your hands on US dollars, you could use it to buy commodities. Now, the US had what I think it was De Gaulle called an exorbitant privilege. That's what he called the gold standard. But this was also another form of exorbitant privilege where everyone else had to earn US dollars in order to buy commodities and crude oil, but the US could just print it up for itself. And this is one reason that the US won the Cold War. It's one reason that the US has been so dominant culturally and economically for the past 40 or 50 years. And it's also helps to explain a lot. Once you understand how the petrodollar system works, you understand what's been really a major driver of what you can only call the US's really bizarre foreign policy decisions of the past 40 years. Why have we chosen to get involved in these desert landscape countries that don't really seem to provide a serious threat to the US? Back in late 2000, early 2001, Iraq began to sell their crude oil for euros instead of US dollars. This got foreign policy makers very upset, and just a couple years later, by early 2003, the US had invaded Iraq, supposedly in response to some other events that happened in 2001. But I think these currency decisions are the real drivers behind US foreign policy. If you're finding this video helpful so far, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button, and also share this video with a few friends you think might be interested in it. This also explains why the US was so obsessed with Gaddafi. Gaddafi was trying to sell oil for euros and also selling it for physical gold and trying to set up his own pan-African currency. And so for some reason, for some inexplicable reason, in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, and in the 2010s, the US became extremely concerned with the freedoms of the Iraqi people and the Libyan people, and pretended to have all these concerns for the people, and decided they suddenly needed democracy and their countries needed to be bombed. And I would suggest that what was really behind it is the U.S. trying to hold together its this petrodollar system. Now, further cracks in the petrodollar system began to show in 2018 when China began taking its first steps to pay for oil directly using its own currency, using the renminbi yuan. And this was a very, very big step, because before, China really needed to sell goods and services, mostly sell manufactured goods, get US dollars, and buy crude oil with this. Obviously, China needs to import a lot of its energy, and so the US dollar was essential to China. China recycled its trade reserves, its trade surplus into US Treasuries as well, and we ended up with another sort of US dollar recycling. But China was very smart, decided, they saw what happened to Russia and the US sanctions against it, and decided that they wanted to begin to be able to use their own currency for these things and not have to use US dollars. The Bank of Russia earlier this year revealed their foreign currency reserves, where the actual Russian central bank is storing their money, and 13% of it, up from 12% the year before, is stored in the Chinese yuan. Now, the only way you can get yuan, because it's a non-convertible currency, is to sell goods or services for yuan. Russia has obviously been trying to diversify away from the US dollar. It's tired of sanctions. It's tired of having its US dollars in banks frozen throughout the world. And as a result, it's been moving more towards accumulating gold and also seeking to do trade in euros and in Chinese renminbi or yuan. Now, Russia is too big to bomb into oblivion like we did to Iraq and Libya, so it's able to get away from this, get away with this. But we can see the evidence of this. We don't know for sure that they're doing it, but this is the most likely way that that the Russian central bank is able to accumulate so many renminbi on their balance sheet. The whole idea is, let's cut out the middlemen. Who needs the US dollar? It's a very good deal for Russia as well. They sell some oil and natural gas to China. They keep some of that renminbi or yuan on their country or central bank balance sheet. And then they also use the yuan to buy stuff from China's factories. So this is a beneficial thing. And there's no reason really to have the US dollar in the middle. This is how economic systems progress. You try to cut out the middlemen, cut out inefficiencies. And obviously China and Russia, as emerging world powers, are not that fond of the U.S. and don't like that the U.S. has this exorbitant privilege of being able to print up U.S. dollars to buy scarce commodities. So this helps to explain a lot. It also helps to explain what just happened a couple days ago, where Russia and China made a new 30-year agreement to sell. Russia will sell natural gas to China, and they will settle this in euros, thus bypassing the U.S. dollar completely. Europe is obviously very dependent on Russia for its energy, especially in the winter, and as such, the euro really can't do much to sanction Russia, and so Russia feels comfortable doing at least some of this trade in euros. China's happy to do that and bypass the U.S. dollar as well. So I would suggest, when you see this Ukraine news, you read between the lines. And it's always strange when the U.S. wakes up and is suddenly concerned about the freedom-loving people, quote-unquote freedom-loving people of some country, and then decides that it has to somehow get involved. What's usually behind that is trying to shore up the petrodollar system or any of these other U.S. dollar recycling systems. And this was made very clear when Biden threatened a few days ago, saying that he would cancel the Nord pipeline if Russia, or would seek to cancel it if Russia invades Ukraine. And so this is what's really going on behind the scenes. We have a great power competition between the US and China and Russia. And I would suggest that these currency wars are part of it. This is a very, very significant thing that Russia and China are doing more and more business like this with each other and bypassing the US dollar in the process. So if crude oil, if natural gas, if other commodities can easily be sold for renminbi or euros, the US dollar no longer has this monopoly on global commodity trade. And as such, there's less demand. There's less reason for central banks and countries to hold US dollars. Less foreign demand for US dollars ultimately means less foreign demand for US Treasuries, which is usually how US dollars are stored, whether it's in T-bills or T-notes or the long bond. But it means less foreign demand for US Treasuries. And so there's this problem that the US has. Who is going to buy up all of that US debt that used to be naturally mopped up through petrodollar recycling. And we do know that the US has to continue to issue a lot of debt. It's bringing in about $4 trillion in tax revenue, and it's spending $7 trillion even before all the extra spending plans that Biden and the current Congress want to do. So there's this $3 trillion budget deficit that has to be made up for by issuing debt. If you're spending more money than you're bringing in, you have to borrow money. The U.S. government is no different, and so we need these foreign holders of U.S. Treasuries. But if foreign countries no longer need to stockpile U.S. dollars to buy commodities, if they can, at least on the margins, start diversifying into renminbi and euros, this means less demand for U.S. Treasuries. And the problem with this is that rates are still so low. There's not a lot of domestic demand for treasuries either. And so the buyer of last resort remains the Federal Reserve, the U.S. central bank. They're going to need to continue to print up money. They can pretend they're going to hike rates really high. They can pretend that they're going to let their balance sheet roll off and do this tapering or even quantitative tightening, where they sell off the treasuries on their balance sheet or allow them to roll off. But this cannot happen because of this budget deficit, because of the huge off-balance sheet liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Obviously, the U.S. can't stop spending on defense when we're in a global superpower competition or global new power competition. And then there's interest on the debt. So what this means is the more other currencies are used for commodity trade, the less demand for U.S. dollars, the fewer foreign buyers of U.S. debt. And this means that the Federal Reserve, needs to continue to print money and monetize the debt, buy up its debt. What is happening here is we are seeing the collapse of the petrodollar standard, and it's getting more and more severe. It's one thing if Iraq and Libya want to break off. It's something completely different if global powers like Russia and China want to break away from this. And it's very clear, especially with this latest pipeline agreement, that that's what they want to do. I would suggest that this is bringing us closer to a Bitcoin standard. Bitcoin is becoming and will become the new global settlement asset, replacing U.S. Treasuries. So rather than central banks storing their wealth in U.S. Treasuries, which are a very bad investment because inflation is much higher than the yield on these U.S. Treasuries, instead of using U.S. Treasuries, corporations, central banks, governments, individuals, institutions will begin to store their wealth and settle trade ultimately in Bitcoin as well. We live in a digital age. There's no way we're going back to a shiny yellow metal standard. Russia, I think, is very smart to be holding gold and to be stockpiling gold instead of stockpiling US dollars. There are some hints that they want to get into Bitcoin mining, but I think this is where the US has a real advantage. We have all the Bitcoin miners here now, and we have this, at least traditionally, we've had this respect for freedom and private property and the rule of law. And one way we can help to shore up the system would be for the Federal Reserve to print money and start buying Bitcoin and move the world closer to this Bitcoin standard after having taken a large Bitcoin position on the US government or the central bank balance sheet. This would be a very smart transition for the US rather than ceding all of this currency power to the euro or the yuan. I'm doubtful that the US will be smart enough to do this, we really are moving much closer to a spy coin, a surveillance coin, otherwise known as a central bank digital currency. But I still hold out hope that sane minds will prevail in government and see the erosion of the petrodollar standard and take steps to set up a Fort Knox for Bitcoin in the US and help to transition the world to a Bitcoin standard. El Salvador is already on a Bitcoin standard, and the first superpower that moves to a Bitcoin standard will have a real advantage because other countries will need to pile on. And so it's inevitable that Bitcoin becomes this sort of global settlement standard, and it's just a question of who the winners and losers are going to be. And the sooner you get into Bitcoin, especially as a nation state, the larger your geopolitical advantage is. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.